Hello, I wanted to give you guys a basic introduction to reptile parasites. For people new to reptiles, just getting into reptiles, or maybe you've had, one or two pet reptiles here or there, and now you're thinking about taking the plunge and getting a little bit more serious about it. Reptile parasites is scary and something comes up a lot. Doesn't need to be. There are a couple of truly scary parasites that we don't have effective treatments for, but outside of those specific scenarios, most parasites you're going to encounter, we're going to be able to handle. And so I just wanted to go over some basic information about that. So, the most important thing to know about parasites are even those that are considered fairly benign, like pinworms, can become problematic in captivity. And the reason is, if you're a snake and you're sort of wandering around out in the wild and you're defecating somewhere, then you're probably just going to keep slithering off, and you're probably not going to develop a massive infection of parasites because your home range is going to be relatively large. And it's just not going to be. There's going to be other things in the environment that are also killing many of the parasitic organisms and their eggs and so on and so forth. Whereas in captivity, cleanliness is going to become very important in order to prevent super infections of parasites from building up. So you're going to want to remove feces and clean the cage immediately whenever newly acquired specimens, which are likely infected with parasites, come into captivity. That's going to be hopeful in keeping those numbers from building up, and you're not going to be able to remove the parasites effectively unless you do that either. So you need to think when you're bringing something in and you're quarantining it in a different room in the house, or maybe even a different location altogether, depending on the biosecurity you need for the size of your collection. You're going to want to be thinking about the enclosure you have them in initially for it to be able to be cleaned and disinfected. And if you run into something particularly nasty, you probably want to be able to maybe even just consider throwing that out and replacing it. The other thing is you want to be changing the water often. A favorite place for snakes to defecate is in the water. Plus, they could drag other smaller amounts of parasitic eggs, one way or another, into the water. And in a warm, environment, I change the water on all my reptiles every other day, regardless of parasites or not parasites, and I change it daily whenever I know there's a parasitic infection that I'm trying to get rid of. I like to wear gloves. Gloves are not an absolute guarantee you won't spread something from one enclosure to the next. Gloves could have little micro tears and things you may not notice in them. It's also important when you're wearing gloves to take them off properly. Now, if you Google how to remove gloves, you're going to get things that are like for prepping for surgery, or sterile gloves, and they come like in a one glove in a package. That's not really affordable for me. I do buy the gloves in pack. I buy 1,000 at a time, and it. But you still want to use good glove removal technique. You can look up videos on nursing websites, and there's probably plenty of nurses on YouTube, doctors, and so on and so forth that will show you proper glove removal technique. That's a critically important. You want to remove the gloves properly. You want to immediately discard them. And even with wearing gloves, you still need to wash your hands often. I mean, I wash my hands between species, and certainly if I think anything may be sick, if anything's in quarantine, if something has a known parasitic infection, I'm certainly going to be washing my hands between each cage in those types of situations. So the goal here, when you bring something in that may have parasites, you want to prevent the buildup of those parasites so it doesn't develop a super infection. And you also want to prevent the spread of any type of parasitic organism, as well as other disease causing organisms as well. There's things probably worse than most parasites out there, but just to give one example. So, when we're talking about cleanliness and parasites, you're going to hear people talk about bleach. And I love bleach. Bleach is an effective product for many, but not all parasites, viruses, and bacterias. So bleach is going to be helpful, but it's not going to be the be all end all. You still kind of need to know what parasites you're dealing with because there are a few like crypto that bleach is not effective for, and you're going to need to use ammonia in those cases. But as a general purpose disinfectant, bleach is very good. A couple of things to be aware of is that you need to be using a fresh bottle. So this is some information I dug up from Scripps, which is a not-for-profit biomedical research facility in Florida and California, and I'll provide a link to that at the end. But they say that the bottle loses about 20% of its effectiveness within 1 year, and begins degrading after about 6 months, even in the original bottle. So you need to make sure the bottle is fresh. And beyond that, you're going to need to dilute it to the right solution for whatever you're dealing with. General purpose disinfection usually calls for about 10% bleach solution. And that solution is only going to stay good for about 1 day. That's as long as it's going to stay potent for. Once it's mixed, it's going to degrade much faster. So if you need to mix a lot and use it for a longer solution, say a week, 20% solution stays good for about 1 week. Longer than that, you really just need to keep it in the bottle and mix it closer to the time you're actually going to use it. Now, bleach does have quite a strong odor. Fortunately, it comes off surfaces fairly cleanly. But I triple rinse after I use bleach and let it dry. I actually let it dry for 24 hours because, just if you breathe in some bleach while you're cleaning with it, you'll see it's a little bit hard on your lungs, and a reptile being trapped in a let's say a tub where there's not a ton of air exchange with something like that seems to me like it could cause some problems. So I just like to make sure all the smell is completely gone. The triple rinse helps with that, but I still let it thoroughly dry, and then at that point it's completely safe. Now, I have nothing against shotgun treatments. I know a lot of people who deal with imports, and particularly where they know that these species are coming in and they always have a high parasite load. I have no problem with shotgun therapy. But if you're someone new to reptiles in particular, you may not know all of the details about which species typically come in with what. You may not have that inside information. And I think, just as a general rule, you probably don't want to be doing shotgun treatments when you're new to this. A couple of things. One, you know, you need to make sure you're properly applying the medications. That means you need a digital scale. You need to weigh each reptile and give it the appropriate amount of medication. The medication needs to be mixed properly, so you need to get it from a source that can be trusted. And you need to make sure that the medication is being applied properly, which means in the right form. A lot of these for parasites can just be orally performed for these internal parasites we're discussing. You need to make sure it's given with the right number of days in between dosages for what you're treating it for. And you need to make sure that you're keeping the environment clean during this time, like we talked about in the previous slide. Otherwise, it's going to get reinfected in between doses. And just to give you a heads up, in my experience, one dose very rarely would ever treat anything thoroughly. I have often found it takes 2 to 3 doses before I'm getting clean fecals. And I've gotten back a clean fecal, and only a couple weeks later, it was reinfected. So, it's rarely going to be a single dose thing. You're going to have to keep the environment clean between those doses until you get everything all cleared up. So that brings us to getting tested. So the best way to treat the parasites are to know what it has. Another thing is you don't have to be treating for every parasite under the sun. No medication works for all parasites. So you need to know if it's clean. If the animal's clean, you don't be giving it parasitic medications for no reason. And if it's not clean, the way you're going to know exactly what you need to be treated for is by getting it tested. So you can do that through a local veterinarian. The advantage of that is obviously they get a very fresh sample. There's not a lot of thought into it. You just call up some local veterinarians, preferably someone who's a known good reptile veterinarian, although just about any veterinarian can tell you what general class of parasites you're dealing with and can give you the basic information on maybe some treatments. The good news about a more specific reptile veterinarian is they might be able to advise you more properly about if you even need to treat a particular group of parasites or not, based on their familiarity with that species, based on their literature review, and based on their ability to reach out to colleagues. Now, if for one reason or another you absolutely can't take it to a local veterinarian for whatever reason, mail order is another option. There's one called Perfect Pet Products I've used, cost maybe about $20 to have a single fecal sample analyzed by them. If you have a large collection, you'll want to call them up and talk about options for getting a large collection tested. So the basic procedure is you're going to get your animal tested. You're going to find out if it has parasites. You're going to find out if those parasites are something that's going to be problematic and what numbers they're occurring in. Based upon that, you very likely may need to treat. Um, Once you've treated, you're going to need to do follow-up exams. Even if you follow the recommended protocol, it doesn't mean it worked because people have improperly used medications and overused medications in the past, so there may be a resistant organism. It may be that you didn't keep the environment clean enough, and so they've gotten reinfected. Some of them, like Coccidia, it can be difficult to get them taken care of. I know the last time I had an animal treated for Coccidia, I think I got, like I said, I got a negative back and then treated a little more and a little more. And eventually I got 3 fecals negative, but it took a little bit of doing, took a little bit of time, took a little bit of persistence. Um, Things like hookworms and penworms, those are usually pretty easily treatable. Um, some of them, again, like I said, you may not need to treat, like penworms. If you're keeping the environment very clean, the numbers are probably going to be low, and your veterinarian may or may not advise you to treat them. But you do want to, if you're not treating something, you want to monitor the population, and they can tell that based on approximately based on the number of parasitic eggs they're finding in the feces. Because even things like pinworms can cause prolapses and things like that in blockages in large numbers. Um, so some things like Coccidia, difficult to treat. If it's in very low numbers, your veterinarian may or may not have you treat it. Personally, I like to just go ahead and treat things for the most part because I have, a number of different species coming in all the time, and I don't want it to spread from one animal to another. So I tend to treat most things unless my veterinarian is strongly objected to it. Even if you're doing the mail order, some of the medications are not as easy to get, or they may not be easy to get in a format that's very easily usable to you. And of course, no matter where you get the medications, you want to make sure that they're mixed at the appropriate concentrations and that they're fresh enough that they're going to be effective, so that you're going to get the maximum value out of it. So that's just a basic overview of some parasites, some basic facts about it, going about it. Nothing too scary usually. Like I say, there's only a couple that you really need to be super worried about. The others, you just treat them, and tends to not be a huge deal. If you're keeping your animals hydrated during the treatment procedures, I personally have not had any problems with any of these things. Regarding external parasites, everything we've talked about so far has been internal parasites. Regarding external parasites, you can have ticks come in on fresh samples. Obviously, you're going to remove those, just like you wouldn't leave a tick on your person. You're not going to leave it on your reptile either. And the other common one that comes in are, of course, mites. Um, I really don't run into a lot of problems with mites. What I do is the night before a shipment, whatever reptiles are coming in, I spray paper towels with provenamite. I let the paper towels or paper product, whatever they're going to be going on, dry overnight, and then I keep that in with them. I keep the paper treated for the first couple of weeks they're in, and based upon that, I really haven't had any issues with snake mites spreading throughout my collection. If I have something that goes on a moist substrate, I don't like to spray provenamide on a moist substrate because then it's kind of hard to know if it's dissipated and dried properly or not. In those cases, what I like to do is use the Frontline Flea and Tick Spray. Now, this is not the concentrated stuff that you're rubbing between the back and the shoulders. This is the Flea and Tick Spray. It comes in a spray bottle. And what I do with that is I put on a pair of gloves because obviously, I don't need to treat myself for parasites, external parasites. I put on a pair of gloves, just spray the gloves with the Frontline, rub the gloves together, and then rub it up and down the body of the snake. Some people say you need to rub it underneath the chin and stuff. I haven't found any of that necessary. I actually had some animals come in with mites, just using that procedure, and probably got it rubbed over, 2/3 of the snake's body. That killed the snake mites very, very effectively. The other thing you could use is you can get these from a company called Arbico. They're called Predatory Mites. Now, personally, I would not use predatory mites if I knew a snake were infected with snake mites. I'm afraid that might be a little bit slow acting. And, I did read where someone had kind of done a long-term look at treating an active snake with that, and, it stayed off. A couple of things with those snake mites, at least the varieties that are available to us commonly here in the United States. They need a little bit of moisture, so if you're keeping it on a paper product, it may not be effective. Keeping it on some kind of a slightly moist substrate like cypress mulch, it probably will be effective. But if I get an active snake mite, I haven't had any issue with the Frontline. You just rub it on the snake, let it dry until there's no smell left, and then put the snake in the enclosure, and I haven't had any issues with that. Some people withhold the water bowl for 24 hours. I've heard of problems when the snakes were very small and it wasn't allowed to dry all the way. I've also once had an issue with Venomite where I sprayed a plastic container, let it dry out for about an hour, and then put a paper towel and put some small colubrid snakes in there, very small, probably were basically hatchlings, and they started they were flipping upside down and convulsing and couldn't right themselves and things like that. Now, the good news is I saw it in time and removed them from that environment, and then they were fine. In future discussions with other people had seen something similar at times, and that's why I started spraying the towels directly and letting them dry out completely. Because if you do it that way, then there's basically no real risk that I've ever seen. Whereas opposed to the plastic, even though I let it sit out for probably 2 hours, it was still harboring fumes in there somehow. And the fumes are what seem to bother the reptiles, not the dried product. So anyway, that's a basic introduction to parasites. I hope that helps. And if you are interested in parasites, I may do more specific videos later.